It's 1981, and Dunkin' Donuts, who are known for these things called donuts, roll out an ad campaign known as Fred the Baker. And Fred was the guy that had to get up really early in the morning because it was time to make the donuts. And Ted was really, really tired, but he had to do it because, he worked for Dunkin' Donuts. Of course, now America runs on Dunkin'. They're all about coffee because apparently, donuts aren't good for you. And apparently coffee is? That's always my question. And my point is, have you ever had a time when you're like, time to make the podcast? And that's what we're talking about today. It's the last Monday of the month. And that's where I ask you a question. And the question is, what keeps you going when your podcast isn't growing? And we're going to go from Fred the Baker to Fred the Veteran with a Because of My Podcast story. Hit it, lady.
The School of Podcasting with Dave Jackson.
Podcasting since 2005. I'm your award-winning Hall of Fame podcast coach, Dave Jackson. Thanking you so much for tuning in. If you're new to the show, this is where I help you plan, launch, grow, and if you feel like it, monetize your podcast. My website is schoolofpodcasting.com. Use the coupon code LISTENER, that's LISTENER, on either a monthly or yearly subscription. And keep in mind that comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. I feel like I'm doing it overnight. Welcome to Dave Jackson After Hours. As I record this, it's Monday, March 28th. It's 2:43 in the morning. Welcome to the Night Bird. Yeah, I just got home from Podcast Movement, and my body doesn't know when to sleep. It doesn't know. So I'm awake, and we'll talk about streaks and hitting your schedule and things like that towards the end of the show. But I was lucky enough to do an interview with Fred from Podcast Reporter, and I'll have a link out in the show notes. That's going to be at schoolofpodcasting.com/820. So we have a lot of people that contributed to this show. So I'll have links to everybody's podcast, schoolofpodcasting.com/820. And I was talking to Fred about Podcast Movement, and then Fred emailed me back and said, oh, you know what? I forgot to tell you. I have a Because of My Podcast story. So if you're new to the show, a Because of My Podcast story is simply something that happened to you, and it wouldn't have happened except, well, you have a podcast. So here's Sergeant Fred.
Hi, Dave. This is Fred Castaneda speaking, a podcast reporter at podcastreporter.com. Also, I have another show called 2030podcast.com, as well as thestrugglingbiz.com. But anyway, I wanted to let you know that I have a story for you because of my podcast. Recently, I was able to get some therapy and also some closure addressing the PTSD I got during the Vietnam War. I am being treated, have been treated for PTSD as a combat infantryman during the Vietnam War 50 years ago. As a matter of fact, my photograph actually was appearing in a magazine about the Vietnam War, and it was taken 50 years ago by a UPI, United Press International reporter that came with us on a mission. And by the way, because of my podcast, another podcaster, his name is Mac Payne, actually found out about it. I contacted him. He contacted me, and he did a podcast about it because he has a podcast show called Vietnam Veteran News at VietnamVeteranNews.com. He's got 2,000 episodes close to it. And he interviewed me for about 45 minutes, and it was very painful and stressful for me to get it out, but over the telephone, we did an interview, and by the way, this served as a type of therapy for me. I hadn't talked to anybody about this before, but for 45 minutes, I answered the questions about the types of things I had to do in my life after returning home from combat to address my PTSD problem. And Mac Payne got it out of me. He basically had the questions lined up. And that 45-minute session that we had over the telephone acted as therapy to help me get a lot of closure that was pent up for me for 50 years of PTSD problems because of my experience in the Vietnam War. and the problems I had, not only physical, but mental and emotional as well. So I wanted to let you know that because of my podcast, he found out about me, and he allowed me to be an interviewee on his show in order to discuss my story of the Vietnam War and how my problems with PTSD were addressed by my experiences, and he wanted to share that with other people. He didn't realize that the biggest beneficiary of that particular show was myself, and that it helped me get a lot of closure and helped me to adjust and deal with the PTSD problems I still have to this day. Anyway, Dave, just want to let you know, so podcasting can be therapeutic, and for me it was, especially with my experience in the war. So that's my discussion. That's my story of how, because of my podcast, I was able to get therapeutic help and closure for a big emotional problem. Thanks, Dave. And by the way, great job on your interview for the show and the conference of Podcast Movement Evolutions 2022 in Los Angeles.
Thank you, Fred. I'll have links out at schoolofpodcasting.com/820 again for everything. It's a balmy 59 degrees in the studio as I record this because my furnace has been off all week. So Podcast Movement was a blast. I got to tell you, it was funny. I asked so many people, hey, what was your big takeaway from the day? And they all said the same thing. It's so great seeing people. So there were a lot of people. It was well attended. And Podcast Movement Evolutions is a different kind of animal. It's a little more industry based. And so I think for myself, now I'm at the Libsyn booth. If you're new to the show, I work for Libsyn. It's short for Liberated Syndication, LIBSYN.com. And while I'm talking about it, you can get a free month over there using the coupon code SOPFREE. And so where if I'm at PodFest or, for lack of a better phrase, a normal podcast movement, we have more people who are just starting. And this was a little more geared towards industry and people that were, for lack of a better phrase, further down the road in their podcasting endeavors. So it was great to see everybody and catch up and pretend like you're 22. And I got to say one thing. After seeing Paris Hilton be a DJ at one of the parties there, I have to get a set of Sequin headphones because those are just special. And I think it would grow my audience as well if I got a pair of Sequin headphones. But she was doing her thing. She was, moving the knobs and things like that. And I tell you what, I'm going to take a quick second here, and we're going to do some Paris Hilton trivia just for 2 seconds. How old do you think Paris Hilton is? I'll tell you right after this.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out Paris Hilton is 41. And in a non-Me Too, non-creepy, middle-aged white guy, she looked good. I'll just say that. She was not an ugly person. How is that? Is that non-offensive? Hi, you're not ugly. At any rate, who knows what you're allowed to say anymore. Let's get to the question of the month. What keeps you going when your podcast isn't growing? Got some very interesting answers here. Let's get to them. Here is Scott, who I was lucky enough to have lunch with Scott from the show What Was That Like? I actually listened to Scott on the way home about some poor guy that basically almost fell off a mountain, except he caught a bush on the way down. You can find that at whatwasthatlike.com. And here's Scott explaining what keeps him going.
Good morning, Dave, and good morning to all my fellow School of Podcasting listeners. This is Scott Johnson. Remember back when you were a little kid and you couldn't wait to grow up? Part of being a little kid is just that, being little. You were always shorter than any of the grown-ups, and you were even shorter than some other kids just because they were older and, of course, taller. When our kids were growing up, we had a particular door frame in our house, and every once in a while, we would have them stand with their back to it, and we'd make a little mark at their height, and then we'd write their name and the date next to it. We also did that with some of our exchange student kids that came from Ecuador and lived with us. It was always interesting to see the difference as each of them grew. And it actually became such a family memory that when we sold that house, I took out that piece of wood from the door frame and we still have it today. The point is, when you're a kid, you just feel small. You don't wake up one morning and feel like you're growing. And that's because it happens slowly. But when my kids got a new mark on the door frame, it was clear that they had grown since the last time, even though they didn't feel it happening. For my podcast, I've kept track of the stats since the beginning. That's just my nature. I like to track numbers. Whenever I release a new episode, I keep track of the number of downloads after 24 hours, and after 1 week, and after 4 weeks. I have a spreadsheet with all that information. And I can tell you, there are times when I feel like the podcast is just growing too slowly. Or maybe it feels like it's at a plateau and not growing at all. But then when I go back to my spreadsheet and look at the numbers from a year ago, I'm almost always surprised at how much the show has grown. I mean, if I put out a new podcast today and I got the downloads that I got a year ago, I would wonder if something's wrong. It's always a great encouragement to see that the audience of today is substantially bigger than the audience from a year or 2 years ago. So that's my recommendation. I'm not saying to obsess over your numbers, but I do think it's a good idea to keep track of them. Just like the notches on that door frame, your download numbers just might indicate that your show is growing even when it doesn't feel like it. I'm Scott Johnson, and my podcast is called What Was That Like? Each episode is a conversation with a regular person who's been through some type of extremely unusual situation, such as escaping from your house just as it explodes, crashing into the ground after a skydive problem, or getting a job as a modern-day lighthouse keeper. Those are a few of the more than 100 past episodes. The guest comes on the show and tells the story of what happened firsthand. Listen on any podcast app or at whatwasthatlike.com.
Thank you, Scott. It was great hanging out with you. And I'm going to say this one more time, and I'm not going to say it again until the very end. And that is, again, everybody's links are going to be out at schoolofpodcasting.com/820. Or if you're listening to this on an app, you should see links to their shows in the description.
Hey, Dave, this is Kyle Hebert from the Intergalactic BoomBox podcast. I do geek news with a comedic slant. I'm an anime and video game voice actor from things like Dragon Ball Z and Street Fighter. And basically on my show, I have interactions with my own original character voices on board a fictitious spaceship. And I've been doing this show for almost a year, averaging about 70 downloads a week, despite a much bigger social media following. And that discrepancy is indeed discouraging to not see growth, despite hours spent each week constructing a highly produced 10-minute show. But what really lit a fire under my butt to start and keep going is the awesome work of Podcasting 2.0. Adam Curry, Dave Jones, all those great indie developers, all those minds putting together next-gen stuff, images, chapters, streaming value for value. That is amazing stuff. Seeing Satoshis coming in my way, boostograms, listeners interacting that way. As a tech nerd, yeah, it may be considered bleeding edge, but it's so cool. And I think this is the future of podcasting, and probably just, it's going to just transform the way media consumption and creators and all that stuff. Anyway, thanks for the opportunity. For more info on my show, the intergalacticboombox.buzzsprout.com. Thanks so much, Dave. I'm a big fan. Can't wait to hear the next episode. Thanks.
Thank you, Kyle. And if you want a domain for that, if you want to lose the Buzzsprout part, just go over to coolerwebsites.com. They've got really inexpensive domain names. And yeah, and if you're new to the whole value for value, newpodcastapps.com, that kind of thing, go over to leadingthebleeding.com/video. And again, see, I said I wasn't going to say it. I'm going to say it again. Links in the description, schoolofpodcasting.com/820. I've got a video that shows you how you can set up your show to receive streaming Bitcoin.
Hi, this is Mark Vinette from the History of North America podcast, where I explore the wonderful and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography at markvinette.com. What keeps me going, Dave, is the love of my topic, North American history, my faithful audience, interaction with my fellow podcasters, and the enjoyment I derive from working with my teenage son, Sean, who is my partner, audio technician, and sound editor.
That is so cool to be doing a podcast with your kid, because you know in the future you're going to be sitting in a rocking chair. Go, remember that time we did the cast thing with the internet radio's fun? And you'll dig out the chip in your head where it's saved, whatever it is. But Thank you so much, and that's a great reason.
My name is Colby, a.k.a. also known as, if you will, Sweaty Spooks from the Guardians Ghostcast podcast. We're a Destiny 2 podcast that focuses on interviewing other players of the game. This term is known as a Guardian. And we find out more about them, their walk of life, where they come from, whatever they're willing to talk about. However, Dave, I'm going to make this a little more intense. What keeps you going when your podcast is failing? Which is the perspective that I come to you today from. If you were to look up Guardians Ghostcast, we have, that's right, Dave, you guessed it, less than 10 episodes, 2 of which one of our co-hosts did solo. We were trying to do a weekly podcast relating to our video game. We enjoyed the most to interview other Guardians, like I said, to find out more about them. And that's really what kept me going. That's what I wanted to do. But life happened. At no point do we say, oh, we just don't feel like doing this anymore. It came a point where we had plans and life discarded those plans. So now the reason why I believe I'm uniquely qualified to answer this particular question of the month is because I am pre-launch of a new podcast. And in this podcast, I am endeavoring a solo podcast. And the reason why I chose to go solo is mostly just because I want to be able to take my time with the editing process. And, it's just a lot less pressure, especially when there comes a difference of time zones. And that was really our main factor. I'm 4 hours ahead. I feel like I'm just rambling. Let's come back to the question. What keeps you going when your podcast isn't growing? Okay. So first off, for me personally, it's interviews. I genuinely enjoy talking to other folks. It's also a chance to take some dedicated time as a break from the stresses of everyday life. For me personally, podcasting is a labor of love. It's a passion. It's something you enjoy doing. And if you don't enjoy doing, then why are you podcasting? It also exercises the creative aspects of our brains, which can contribute to our overall mental health. And that is another thing that keeps me going. Dave, School of Podcasting folks, listeners, appreciate you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Hope this answers the question.
Yeah, we're going to talk about this towards the end, but one of the things you can do that will help you is to record a few episodes and then see how long did it take you, and then delete them if you want, because then you can say, okay, it took me 16 hours to do one episode. Do I have 16 hours every week to do a podcast? And if the answer is no, then don't do a weekly podcast. And so in this case, he's saying, hey, I'm going solo. I love the conversations, so we're going to keep the stuff that I love. And I know I have a show called the Podcast Rodeo Show, and for a very brief period, I started bringing people on when that show was previously solo, and I am definitely going back to solo. When you have a co-host or guest, just the scheduling thing can add a little fire that's making you crispy, right? It can turn up the heat on the pressure and the stress. When you do a solo show, the good news is there's no scheduling conflicts. The bad news is all that content creation stuff is kind of on your shoulders.
Hi, Dave. It's Heather from Watching Netflix Without You and the Politics Free podcast, answering the question of the month. What keeps you going when your podcast is not growing? And I had to actually put kind of a little bit of thought into this, and I think I've narrowed it down to 2 things. Number 1, I'm just truly enjoying myself. I'm meeting new people. I'm making new friends. I get to spend a lot of time with my brother. We live thousands of miles apart, and it's just been really nice staying in touch with him so much more frequently than we used to. That's my number 1. Number 2, ultimately, I think what really keeps me going is that I started podcasting in the beginning because I was just trying to help people get into a better mood. There's a lot going on in society today. There are a lot of reasons to feel stressed. And so I just kind of thought, is there a way I can make a little space where people can come and not be stressed for a while? And so I hold on to these little bits of feedback I get that let me know that I am in fact accomplishing that. One example is that I had a fellow podcaster tell me that she loved the rapport between me and my brother because it reminds her of her and her brother who had unfortunately passed away. So it just gave her a little bit of cheer to listen to. And, you don't always hear from everyone who listens. So when I find out that, hey, I have actually accomplished what I set out to accomplish, even if it's just a little bit here and there, that reminds me of why I started it in the first place, and it keeps me going. And that's it. Again, I'm Heather, and I have 2 podcasts, Watching Netflix Without You. If you love Netflix original films, if you appreciate unpretentious movie reviews, and if you're the kind of person who knows that despite our political differences, we can unite over the love of a good movie or the abject loathing of a terrible one, then this is the podcast for you. Website, WNWYpodcast.com. And thanks to the School of Podcasting, I brought back my first love of a podcast that I had given up on, and I'm so happy about it. It's called the Politics Free Podcast. It's game night. It's sibling rivalry. It's a walk down memory lane. But most importantly, it's politics free, guaranteed. Website, thepoliticsfreepodcast.com. As always, Dave, thank you so much for everything that you do.
I remember in the early days, as Heather is now doing a show with her brother, and there were 3 brothers, they had all grown up and had children, and they missed the days when they would get together and talk about Formula One racing. And so they started a podcast. They could have cared less about how many numbers and downloads and all that other stuff. They just thought it was cool that they now had a reason to get together and say, hey, honey, can you watch the kids for a second? I need to go do my podcast. And the 3 brothers would get together and talk about Formula One racing.
Hey Dave, I'm Dan Smith from Coffee and Space, where we have conversations about the sci-fi characters we love and the journeys they take. Your question of the month has been on my mind lately as I near my 2-year anniversary of podcasting. Despite over 70 author interviews and a handful of scientists behind the scenes episodes, I am still learning about growth and how to find my audience. And honestly, that growth curve can be slow, with many months lagging or even stagnant. Yep, I've considered quitting. All I'd planned for from the start was something to enjoy with my writer friends during the first COVID shutdown. I had no intentions of taking it this far, and it's been a fun ride. But when I factor in prep time, time spent in booking guests with publicists and publishers, editing time, of course, and the engagement in social media watering holes, sometimes it does seem a bit much. But that's why I go back to my tagline. I love having conversations with sci-fi authors about characters we love and their journeys. And when things are going slow or I'm tired of editing or trying to learn new concepts, I remember that it's really about those conversations. You can find my podcast, Coffee and Space, over at www.coffeeandspacepodcast.com. Thanks for everything you do, Dave, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Dan. And yeah, I love that attitude of like, hey, let's look at what do I like about my podcast? Yeah, there's some things that are kind of stressing me out. Maybe the numbers aren't growing as fast as I want, but why am I doing this again? Sometimes you have to remember your why. And in Dan's case, he's like, hey, I love talking to these people, and I'm having fun, and I'm getting to do something that I want to do. So sometimes we kind of get lost in all the talk about monetization and numbers and growing and things like that. And if it's fun, it's fun. Keep doing it.
Hey, Dave, Matt here from the Rogue Retirement Lounge podcast, the retirement planning and investing show specifically for self-employed people. You can find the show at Rogue, that's ROGUE, RogueRetirementLounge.com. So what keeps me going, and do I ever think of quitting? Well, first off, no, I never think about quitting because I love doing my podcast so much. Pretty much everything that I read, hear about, or talk with friends about runs through this little filter in my brain. Would that be a good topic for the podcast? Should I do an episode about this? No, I'm in this for the long haul, and I don't ever think of quitting. As for what keeps me going, there are 2 main things. One is that I have a long-term goal to have the show provide a reasonably good income for me. And I believe that I heard this from your show that most podcasters can expect it to take around 3 years before they're earning appreciable income. Well, I'm just over a year into doing my podcast, so I just keep plodding along, knowing that I've got a couple more years to go before that happens. So for now, it's all about just trying to improve the show, getting better guests, and becoming a better host. And the second thing, and I'm not just saying this to kiss your backside, but every Monday, I listen to the School of Podcasting. You, Dave, help keep me going. I love the show. I've learned a ton from listening, and I appreciate every episode, not just the content, but the craft, the care, and the creativity that you put into your show. Anyway, thanks, Dave, for keeping me going.
Thank you, Matt. That puts gas in my tank. Always great to hear that people are enjoying the show. I do want to clarify something here, and in do so, I need to bust out the business card where it's like, hi, I'm Dave Jackson, Dream Crusher. And what I mean by this is when I did my research for the book, Profit From Your Podcast, available at profitfromyourpodcast.com/book. And yes, I'm going to say it again. I can't help myself. schoolofpodcasting.com/820. That I found that people that were making, more than enough for a Mountain Dew in money, they had been doing it for 3 years. But that is not a guarantee that if you do a show for 3 years, you will make money. I just want to make sure we're aware of this. And I did this in my last presentation at the National Religious Broadcasters where I was speaking. And that is, and it's something that dawned on me. Think about this for a second. And I probably shouldn't say this because I know I'm the guy that wants everybody to start a podcast. But just the thing is, there is a little bit of thing. Well, let's spit it out, shall we, Dave? Welcome to Dave Jackson After Hours. It's 3:06 in the morning, and Dave's brain is turning to mush. Thanks. Here's the deal. Netflix cancels shows. Wait, what? Yeah, think about that. Netflix cancels shows. And if you're like, Dave, yeah, so what? Netflix knows how much you watch. They know what actors you like. They know how often you watch and what genres you like. And yet Netflix creates content that doesn't work. And you're like, yeah, that is true. That's because like everything they make should just be a hit, a gangbuster. And I thought about this, and for me, in my opinion, I think it has to do with two things, and that is luck and timing. So think about timing. Do you really think we all would have been going absolutely crazy bonkers about Tiger King had we not been locked down in a pandemic? That was timing. Now, granted, those people are crazy, and there definitely would have been some word of mouth, but I'm not sure it would have been the fever pitch that now they're making movies of this is the one I don't get. They're doing a movie on Peacock about the series on Netflix. That seems a little too, that seems a little, what's the word? Welcome to Dave Jackson After Hours. It's 3:08 and Dave's brain is turning into mush. Incestual. Really? Are we going to use the I word in a podcast? No, let's bring up another, what's keeping you going.
Hey, Dave and School of Podcasting listeners. This is Brandon Lovinger answering your question of the month for March of 2022. I'm the host of the Start 100K podcast, the podcast designed to help people get to their first $100,000 of net worth and beyond. I discuss personal finance topics centered around getting started and staying motivated toward financial security and independence. You can find me at www.start100k.com or email me at podcast@start100k.com. In regards to keeping myself going, that's actually a pretty easy one. I have a firm belief that people need quality, unbiased financial education and information, and that's really just a deep driver for me. Podcasting just happens to be the format that I'm doing it through. My motivation is really just, I know what it's like to feel dumb for not knowing how to do something financial or how to handle my finances, even though I'm a relatively smart person. And people just don't talk about money. So that's why I'm putting this out there. That's why I'm starting the Start 100K project. I know that you can have a better life and have less stress in your life if you can get a handle on your finances. But getting started and realizing that the American dream, or if you're listening to this in another country, insert your country here. I'm sorry. It's just where I'm from. So I'm very patriotic, and I'm sure you are too. But regardless, that dream of doing better, of getting better and making your life and your family's lives better, it exists. But in order to do that, you have to get your finances in order. So that's what I'm hoping to do with this, and we'll see where that goes. As for quitting, no, not necessarily. I don't really think about quitting. I have thought about reducing the frequency of podcast episodes to bi-weekly or monthly so that I can focus on finishing up college. Regardless, I don't see myself quitting on the Start 100K project anytime soon. As far as the medium, I think podcasting and written articles are going to be my mediums of choice from here on out. I do like to content around from time to time and try out video and stuff like that, but ultimately, I find that a single-threaded medium such as podcasting or writing written material is definitely my strongest suits and the things that I enjoy the most. So I'll tend to do those more because I enjoy them. So I'm still playing around with things and learning, but overall, I've really, really enjoyed the podcast. I've absolutely loved the conversations and opportunities that have come to me from having a podcast. And I just don't see myself ever not doing something like this. Overall, I get to reach multiple people every week to talk about a really sensitive topic to a lot of people. And normally that wouldn't be something I would get to do. And so that's very special to me, and I want to keep that going. Once again, this is Brandon from Start 100K, and you can find me at www.start100k.com. I hope this was helpful, and thanks for everything you do. Have a great April.
Thank you, Brendan. April's question will be coming up in just a minute. First, we're going to hear from Tim.
Hi, Dave. This is Timothy Chemo Bryan, your head instigator for Create Art Podcast, where I help folks tame their inner critic and create more than you consume. And you can find that at createartpodcast.com. I also do Find a Podcast About. And that podcast is helping you outsmart the algorithm and find your next binge-worthy podcast. You can find that podcast at findapodcastabout.xyz. So, Dave, your March question of the month, as you know, is when your podcast isn't growing, what do you do to keep yourself going? And do you ever think about quitting? So, Dave, hopefully nobody's listening to this, but I'm going to get a little personal here. So I do have the avatar, the person that I'm talking to, pretty well in focus for each of my podcasts. And that's all fine and well. And my podcasts aren't for everybody. And that's okay. I'm good with that. But I also have another audience member in mind. And that's my twin 7-year-olds. And they know that Papa podcasts. So I'm a hashtag twin dad podcaster. But I'm estranged from my dad. And I haven't talked to him or seen him in a number of years. He has all my pictures from, basically when I was a baby all the way up until 18. And I highly doubt that I will get those pictures back until he dies, and maybe his wife will send it to me. But I'm of the opinion that they're probably going to end up in the trash someplace. So my daughters don't have any reference to when I was a kid. So I'm doing my podcasts for them when they turn 18. I can turn over all the pictures that I have taken of them. And we're looking at about 5,000 right now. But then they'll also have a copy of my voice in whatever format they're going to be using when they turn 18. That'll be in 11 years. Oh my God. So that's who I'm doing it for, as well as my normal avatar, to, keep my, legacy going with them. So that way they can always, reflect back and go, oh, that's why he was in the man cave in the studio recording something, or that's why he went to a podcast conference for a couple of days and came back. And these are the things that, made him very happy. So that's what keeps me going, even if I don't see a lot of growth in my podcast, because I'm taking a look at the bigger picture, the long game. I'm sure you've had it happen multiple times. You've talked about it on your show where people will download your whole catalog in one shot. The early stuff that you're like, you're cringing at. And then, the current stuff that, after years and years of doing it is very good and polished. So that's what I'm doing. Thank you so much for what you do, Dave. And I hope to see you at Indie PodCon 8 in September. I've already booked the presidential suite at the Holiday Inn, so I'm sorry you don't get that one, but I can't wait to, come up to you and do our 6 feet of distance and, fist bump you or something like that. Have a great day, Dave. And thanks for doing all that you do.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate kind of the vulnerability there. I appreciate you putting that out on the table. Welcome to Dave Jackson After Hours. And can I say it's 3:15 and I'm already finding Alexa a very annoying already. She's interrupting. She's saying things. I think she missed me and she just keeps saying things. I'm like, I did not say the key phrase or whatever. And so, she's on my nerves. Welcome to Dave Jackson After Hours. But I digress because it's now 3:16 in the morning. And what keeps me going? And so as I was writing the show notes, here's something to think about this, because I said I'm going to mention about keeping a streak going. I did my show notes. I did my artwork. I did some of the editing on the road, but Canva, you can reach anywhere. I basically typed my description and all my show notes into Libsyn and then saved it as a draft. And then once those were done, I copied and pasted them into WordPress. So it's a matter of because my flight was delayed. That's why I'm home so late, and a couple other things. And I was like, what can I do? And I'm like, well, Canva's online and Libsyn's online, and I'll just upload the file when I'm done. And as I was sitting there, I'm like, well, what does keep Dave going? You need to answer this question as well. Well, next month, April 4th, if we're going to get specific, I will be celebrating 17 years in podcasting. My first podcast called the Musician Cyber Cooler.
I'm not quite sure how to help you.
See, I'm so tired of her. Anyway, I'll leave that in. And I started that back in 2005. And in one of those early episodes, I said, I think podcasting is going to change the world. And as an educator, my background's in teaching, I really just saw this tremendous opportunity for, it's, the old saying, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're a teacher, you think you can fix everything through communication. Just ask my wives, both of them, or I should say my ex-wives. Let's clear that up. Welcome to Dave Jackson After Hours. That's I do not have two wives. It's 3:19 in the morning. Yeah, so keep that in mind here. But sadly, if you think about it, the opportunity right now to communicate, that's still there. The opportunity is there. I'm not sure people are interested in seeing another point of view. I mean, right now, if I don't think like you or you don't, think like me, then the current culture kind of ignores each other. Or worse, they kind of try to cancel each other in a cage match to the death of recreational outrage coming to Fox. Yeah, it's kind of sad about that. And there are some we have some new members of the School of Podcasting, and the one's going to be called Man in the Middle. And that is, again, about dialogue, because we're not getting that in mainstream media. So anyway, but much like Tim, I see podcasting as a very long shot of some sort of, not so much immortality, because that makes me sound like a Bond villain.
I want to be immortal.
Just a little ego heavy. That you're like, no, I should live forever. But I spent myself back in the day, before podcasting, I spent myself into bankruptcy. That was fun, trying to have children. And I failed. And I just ended up with a big old pile of credit card bills. There's a bad idea. If you guys remember the Saturday Night Live skit, Bad Idea Jeans. If not, Google that. It's very funny. And so a really bad idea is charging fertility treatments on a credit card. I really don't recommend that. But anyway, let's get back to this. So I currently have great nieces and nephews. I love them dearly. But I always dreamed of being a father growing up. I really, really, really wanted to be a dad. And that boat has sailed. I get that. But in the meantime, though, helping kind of aspiring storytellers or entrepreneurs or educators or really just anybody wanting to be an entertainer, when I help them launch their podcast into the world, that's kind of how I attempt to fill the dream of seeing something grow and flourish on their own. So it's a weird kind of, that's I'm sure that's part of it. I feel like I should be sitting on a psychiatrist's couch now and tell me about your parents. I don't know why my psychiatrist has a really accent that's so bad you can't really figure out what that was. When I help someone, launch a show and then later receive that, hey, because of my podcast story, and I'm going to be talking with Connie Abers in a couple weeks on the show, and that's exactly what happened. I helped with her show. 2 years later, she's got a giant list of because of my podcast stuff. And look, obviously, it's all about them. It's their talent. It's their personality. It's their passion. But there is just a hint of my thumbprint on that. And that's really, again, being a teacher. When your student achieves their goal that you kind of help them achieve, it just feels awesome. So that's what I keep doing this for, is it's kind of people like, oh, you're so generous with your time. And here's the word, that's kind of selfish on my part, because the more I help you, the better I feel. It's kind of weird like that. So that's why I do it. I still am, as much as I sometimes can be, Dave Jackson, dream crusher, I do have an optimistic bone in my body. And I really think, again, because I'm a teacher, I think things can be made better through communication, through dialogues, from hearing different points of view, and then learning from them. I had some fun this week sitting next to a table of people that were much younger than I were. I believe they were known as millennials. I was one of them. They're millennial people. Yeah, and it was interesting. And again, there's no judging here, just hearing a different point of view. And I was like, I never would have looked at things like that. And to me, that gets me all just giggly inside when I'm like, that's a different point of view, because I'm definitely of the view that my point of view can always be improved. I'm always looking for constant improvement. And with that, I will say that is why I am, doing this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I want to tack on one more thing here, because part of the reason, right, we're talking about what keeps you going. And sometimes the thing that is stopping you from going is, well, it's hard, right? When things are hard, we want to quit. Doesn't that make sense, right? And so I thought about this. We've talked about burnout in the past, but here are some things, especially if your show isn't growing. And this is the thing I see the most of. And it doesn't matter if you're on Libsyn or Captivate or Buzzsprout or Blueberry or Podbean or whoever it is, make sure your show is listed in all the different directories, especially Apple, Spotify, Google, and Amazon. I would also add to that, there's JioSaavn, there's Ghana, there's Stitcher, and all of these take maybe 5 minutes to submit your show. And you do it once. And that's not going to make you famous, but it's going to make you easier to be found. So when people go, there's a discoverability problem. Well, the first thing you should do is list your show in all the different directories. So that's something you could do. But when it comes to it's taking too much time, and you have to be very careful, especially for those of you with a partner. Look, I have, I'm at a time in my life right now where I'm single. And if you have a spouse, if you have a partner of some sort, the fun part of podcasting is it is new and it's exciting and it's a huge opportunity. Do not ignore your spouse. Make sure to, and I realize this, and can we just talk real for a second? Look, your spouse, you know them inside and out, and you've been with them forever, and blah, 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 and yada, yada, yada. And do you remember when you first met them and you're like, holy cow, this is the person I've been waiting for. And you were, my mom used to call it the gaga stage, and you just want to be with them all the time. When you start podcasting and you actually start to see things, you can kind of get in the gaga phase with podcasting. And because, your love has matured with your spouse, it's not quite so gaga anymore. So I'm here to tell you that do not forget to make time for your spouse. Just as we're talking about time, I've talked about that in the past. There are 3 things that every podcaster needs. They need their health, they need their attitude, and they need their support. And if you ignore your support system, whoever that is, and they turn on you, then that's going to ruin your attitude. So now you don't have support or your attitude. And so you'll probably try to do stupid things like, hey, I'm just going to stay up. I'll sleep when I'm dead. And there goes your health. So keep that support, people, in mind. But what happens? So that's, again, we're trying to avoid burnout and making things hard. And that's one. Get your team on board. But keep in mind, more planning leads to less editing. So if you're just doing an interview and you don't really know who you're talking to, and you're kind of sure why they're on, but whatever, if you're doing an interview or whatever it is, or if you're using a new tool and you didn't really go through the tutorials and you're just kind of going through it, more planning leads to less editing. That'll shorten things up. And of course, let's just state the obvious. If it's taking too much time to do a 20-minute show, why not do a 10-minute show? That should cut the time in half. If you think about it, at least some of it, it'll cut it some way. And then the other one, going back to when your show is hard to do, see if there are additional sources of information. So this might be if you're doing a show about your industry. So let's say I'm a real estate person and I'm doing a podcast about my neighborhood. So in my case, I live in Akron, Ohio. Maybe I want to do the Akron, Ohio podcast. I want to go out and find all the little newsletters, all the different e-zines and things like that, so I can have so much information coming in about Akron, Ohio, so that I can be the source about Akron, Ohio. And if there's only 2, and I'm like, I'm not really getting any good information, I have to really scrape and scratch for something I actually want to talk about, well, then go find some more sources. So that's one of the things where you're investing time to find more sources, but that time you invest, in the end, if you find more sources, and it's the internet, so you're probably going to find more sources, that might give you more information, thus making it easier to create your show. Or subscribe to newsletters. There are a ton of newsletters about podcasting. I'm sure whatever niche you're in, there's probably newsletters for that. So those are some things that, we're talking about keeping the podcast going, and one of the ways to keep the podcast going is to make it easier. And so keep that in mind. If you're having issues with a co-host or something like that, just have that awkward conversation. Just do it. Just say, hey, I'm having a great time doing this podcast with you, but I do have some things that I need to talk about because this is creating a stress in my life, and I'm not going to be able to do this long term. I just want to see if we can come up with maybe some ideas to make this a little easier for both of us. And you go from there. So the good news is, here's another one to think about. In some cases, Mignon Fogarty comes to mind, better known as Grammar Girl. We heard from the person who I couldn't understand your name when you said it, from the Galactic, whatever it was, and the Ghost, and you're now going solo. You said I'm just being honest. Welcome to Dave Jackson After Hours. It's 3:33 in the morning. And, you went solo to make it easier. Sometimes, you just do that. And sometimes he said his first podcast failed. Well, it's out there. It's out there. That is a success. You did what many people did not, and that is you actually launched a podcast. So keep that in mind, and you may actually end up now using the lessons you learned from your, can we put up air quotes, failed podcast, and now you're putting it into a new podcast. And Mignon Fogarty, better known as Grammar Girl was her second podcast. So sometimes that first one, it turns out, was just the training wheels, and you move on to a new show, a second show. And I do always say, said the guy with, I think I have 5 podcasts now. Again, no wife, no kids. Keep that in mind. But when you do multiple shows, I understand why you want to do that, because, hey, I know how to launch this. You've got that part down. Remember, there's only 24 hours in the day to market them and to, again, going back to growing your audience. So I want to thank you so much for tuning in. I'm hoping I will eventually get tired here, because in theory, if the 3 hours carry the 1 divided by pi, something like that, I think it's time for me to go to bed. And thank you so much. We need to get to the April question of the month. I've said it a million times. Everything we mentioned today, you can find at schoolofpodcasting.com/820. Thanks to everyone who contributed. I look forward to hearing your response to the April question of the month. And, we're talking here about my show isn't growing. And just to let you know that everyone who contributed today just had their show put in front of a couple thousand people. And it was free. And you get a link to your website. So that always kind of makes me scratch my head when people go, yeah, I just need to find a new way to promote my show. And I go, I give you an open mic every month. Now I realize some of these questions don't pertain to everybody, and I do. Again, I'm not complaining. I think everybody who contributes, I'm just saying, Scott's here every week, and Scott is crushing it from What Was That Like? I'm not saying I have anything to do with Scott's success, because Scott's good and his show is great. But Scott knows that anytime somebody says, hey, here's an opportunity to promote your show, Scott's going to take that every single time. And you should be looking for those anytime you get an opportunity. And I should just shut up. It's 3:35 in the morning. You're listening to Dave Jackson After Hours. Until next week, take care. God bless. Go podcasting. Class is dismissed. Now, of course, America runs on Dunkin'. It's the whole coffee thing, because donuts apparently are not the healthiest food on the product. Not the healthiest food on the product. Well, that's the way we're going to roll today. This should be, forget it. The bad news is all that content is kind of on your shoulders. That's it. Welcome to Dave Jackson After Hours. And this is Dave. It's now 3:39 in the morning, and I realize I never talked about the whole thing about hitting a streak and all that. We'll do that in a future episode.